I want to introduce our first speaker, if he's here, Na'im McKee. He is the Vice President of Marketing and Growth, and he will be going over lean strategies, how today's marketing leaders deliver explosive growth through alignment, collaboration, and speed. Na'im, I hope I pronounced that correct. How's it going today?
It's going pretty well. You got close. It's actually, my name is actually pronounced Na'im, but I completely
Na'im,
understand.
okay. I apologize for that. Thanks for the clarification.
No, it's perfectly fine. I answered anything that even, sounds like Na'im at this point. So you're good to go, my man.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Really looking forward to your presentation. Do you have it ready?
Yes, I'm up. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can. So I will let you introduce yourself, and I will step back. And we are set to be good till 9:55. So I'll drop in like 5 minutes before. And if you want to stop a little bit earlier than that for Q&A, it's up to you. I'll let you kind of let it run its course. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you guys so much, and thanks for having me here today. I think that Entree's introduction was very, very timely, right? And I think as growth leaders in today's environment, we are under what I would say is an extraordinary amount of pressure, right? To not only deliver on sort of the expectations, the high expectations and ambitions of investors and our leaders, but to also do that with speed and clarity and to really almost be wizards of growth. And so understanding how to apply your trade in today's market with the new shifting challenges is very difficult. I was VP of Marketing and Growth for a company called AboveBoard. It was a company that launched in the executive search vertical, launched in July of 2020. I was employee number 7. And the company was a pre-seed startup in the tech area. So I'm very familiar with sort of the challenges that happen. And for this topic specifically, I really want to focus on sort of what it's like at the beginning, and sort of tell my story in a way that I think will help to impart some really helpful learning on the group today. And may hold some points for how to navigate today's current market. So I'm really going to be focused on strategy and then how to align that strategy to growth. And the way I'll sort of start this is just by saying that there really is nothing simple about achieving high growth, especially the kind of high growth that becomes the subject of like a conference speech. And so it'd be really easy to sort of fall back on a very simplistic way of talking about this. But instead, I'm going to just really take you down the road of sort of what it was like to be a growth marketer, and just really hope that experience and its takeaways can be helpful. So let's all step back in time for just a moment. It's Christmas of 2020. It's Christmas Eve, and my family, we're gathered around our lovely dining room table. Our traditional Christmas Eve dinner is out, bratwurst and red cabbage. The room is the picture of Christmas joy, pulsating electric Christmas lights, a gas fire flickers in the background. My kids are excited. They can't wait for the next morning. My wife is smiling. Everything is speaking to the holiday. And everybody is joyful except for me. You see, at Christmas 2020, I was a nervous wreck. In fact, I was so anxious. I mean, I could barely hold my fork while I was eating dinner. I was consumed with where our membership growth numbers were at. Whether or not I'll even have a new job, or whether or not I even have a job in the new year. The beauty of a Colorado Christmas really couldn't distract me from the feeling of failure and self-loathing. My dream of growth marketing was turning into a nightmare. And I'm asking myself these questions. Why has the performance fallen off? Why is this not working? What am I doing wrong? What can I try now? Am I a failure? The truth was November. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt and cut you off. Your slides are not showing.
Uh-oh.
There we go.
Okay.
Just wanted to jump in real quickly and let you know. So
Okay, so it appears to be that the problem is when I go to full screen mode, it seems to sort of turn off. Would it be okay if I just sort of stay in the current view that we're seeing now?
yeah, I think if just for lack of time, yeah, I think it should be fine.
Perfect. So let's pick back up again. So I'm in the middle of my nervous, anxious breakdown in Christmas of 2020. November had really been a terrible month. When it started as a deluge of member signups to our platform, it dwindled to a trickle. And I was really just throwing myself at this problem obsessively. But my actions had resulted in little progress. And in that moment, I felt like I had fallen well short of expectations. And really, I was terrified of what that meant for my future. 6 months earlier, in July of 2020, I got the call that I had been waiting for. I was being recruited for a position as the VP of Growth for a new startup. In my previous role, I had adeptly navigated the coronavirus. I had led my former company to its most successful quarter in history. So I was coming off a big win. And it felt like this new role was really going to be the payoff for all the hard work, the long nights, grad school, the tutorials, the white papers, the endless YouTube videos. And on top of that, I was the VP of Growth for this amazing new product that really was targeting diversity in the executive search space through a online sort of tech marketplace approach. Once I got hired, my first step was to establish a 5-point strategy for growth. It focused on these 5 strategic actions that would help us meet our objectives. I moved extremely quickly. I built out our marketing assets, developed our brand. I identified our growth tactics to execute. In the rush of doing that, I didn't pay a lot of mind to the fact that we didn't have a very clear budget, that maybe we weren't communicating as effectively, that there were silos between the leaders, and perhaps there was a lack of cohesive marketing research. All in all, I was a man on a mission. And I had what Kanye West says is that ambition, baby. I was determined to succeed. And a week after our launch, right, our first email went out to 5,000 people. It's a list that we had curated prior to launch. And we got 1,500 member signups in the first week. The next week, we landed an article in Fast Company magazine. I mean, the members were rolling in. Through our email and PR strategy, we were about 2,500 members in October. We had deployed our website, our email program, a paid search program in a month, and the V1 of our brand strategy was complete. I couldn't be happier. And then the unthinkable happened. As the initial growth tapered off, the tactics became less effective. We were really in a free fall. So my joy turned upside down. October, 2,500 new members. In November, we had 150. By December, we had 95. Look back, it's really not that hard to see how we ended up in the situation we were in. Doesn't make it less stressful, but in terms of goals, we weren't well coordinated. Really, our objectives were best guess figures. Not uncommon in a startup, but when you map that to having a product that's still in an MVP state, an undefined roadmap, objectives that may be unrealistic, and because our leadership was so siloed, we were anxious. Every other leader was just as anxious and as cautious as I was. We spent more time constraining each other's actions than being supportive. And as a result, our priorities were unclear and non-collaborative. The main takeaway I had coming out of November, right, was that looking back is that there was a real lack of strategic clarity. And this resulted in misaligned timelines, lack of measurement, lack of resources, and quite frankly, lack of trust. All things that terrified me. Of course, looking back now, it's easy to see that these things were the main takeaways. But I wasn't thinking about what was wrong with our organization. At the time, I was consumed with thinking only about what I had done wrong and just confronting my bitter fear of failure. So my learnings caused me to dig in even more. I told myself I wouldn't give up. I would do whatever it takes to be successful, right? And that meant acting on every critical observation. I would create this new amazing strategy that would just wow everyone with its depth and reasoning. I would relentlessly focus on growth channel development. Yeah, I was going to rock this. 6 months later, in spring of 2021, the growth numbers had gotten better, slightly, but that was all that had gotten better. We were still upside down. My strategy went through 6 revisions, essentially gave up on it. Growth had been sporadic. There were a few bright spots, but the lack of strategic clarity remained. As an organization, I didn't feel any better about our progress. My relentless focus was really driving relentless anxiety. And I chased every channel I could. I worked feverishly, and I had so few outcomes to show for my efforts. This is not an uncommon story for growth marketers working at startups, where so much is unknown in the beginning. And you go through this process of achieving short-term gains and then taking steps back. In July, we stumbled upon something that changed our organization. We stumbled upon a growth tactic. And the way we stumbled upon this tactic was really hit or miss. We simply saw that a competitor was leveraging a tactic on a social media platform, and we copied the idea. And it turned out to be highly scalable and really unlocked a lot of explosive growth. As an advantage, it was very easy for us to bring this market to tactic. It dovetailed very nicely with our existing marketing campaigns and strategies. In terms of the disadvantages, it was really right on the line of the terms and services of this social media platform, which is why I'm being a little coy in describing it. It was scalable, but not predictable. So as I'm moving on at this point, right? We hired a new CMO in that August, not surprising considering how the performance had moved through the year. And what this did was it gave me a chance to really focus on scaling this new growth channel and really allowed me to sort of focus strategy on this very specific tactic and to really sort of refine the way in which we were doing things. What did that look like? Well, we needed to bring scale and predictability to this growth channel. That was our objective. In terms of our constraints, we had to stay in budget. We had to avoid violating the terms of service. In terms of actions, we had to identify test variables. We had to deploy rapid iterations. We had to change our schedule for operations. We had to analyze the results. And this helped us to finally prioritize our actions, right? We knew that identifying test variables, getting our operational schedule up and out was key to bringing in scale and predictability. So the process was very simple. It was really research, hypothesize, activate, and analyze. The strategy didn't need to be encompassing. It just needed to be as efficient as was required to accomplish the objectives and create strategic clarity. I didn't know it at the time, but I really stumbled onto something that I came to call lean strategy. What were the impacts of that? Well, this new model turned things around greatly. We ended January of 2022 with 25,000 members acquired at a 60 cents cost to acquire a member. I had pulled the proverbial rabbit out of my hat. That being said, I was still anxious and stressed because there was still unclear direction for our other channels. Our overall marketing strategy was still unclear. I had lost a lot of trust in that previous year, and we still weren't collaborating as effectively as we could. And I started asking myself a lot of really hard questions, like why was the strategy so unclear and difficult? Why did we keep changing directions, and why was there so little trust? So asking those questions and having some space to focus on them really helped me to hone this concept called a lean strategy that I applied to this growth channel that had unlocked this sort of explosive growth for us. Lesson number one was really understanding that strategy has a life cycle to it. It's not something you do in the beginning and then, once it goes kaput, you just start acting and flailing. Strategy has a life cycle. What does that mean? Well, number one, the strategic lifestyle, and the first step is really analysis of the current internal and external environment. The internal environment is really all about your product, right? All about your organization, your vision, your mission, your brand strategy, right? The external environment is understanding the challenges that exist outside of your company. I think this is extremely important now in this environment, right? That we're all, as marketers, taking the time that's necessary to do that analysis of our current internal and external environment. We have to, and the second step, the second part of the strategic life cycle is developing objectives to realize value, mitigate risk, and exploit opportunities, right? So we're looking at our internal environment, we're looking at the external environment, and we're now shaping our objectives to realize value, right? We're trying to minimize the risk and at the same time take care to exploit opportunities. In the third stage of the strategic lifestyle, you have the reaction of the external environment. This is the reaction of your competitors, right? How the market responds to the things that you do. And then in the fourth stage of the strategic life cycle is analysis of the current internal and external environment. So it's really analyzing what you've done previously and sort of starting this process again. And what I will say about the strategic life cycle, right, is that this process repeats itself time and time again. If we think about classic strategic theory, if we think about Porter's 5 forces and sort of understanding the external forces that impact our environment from a marketing standpoint, right? This strategic life cycle just puts that in the context of how this impacts the decisions we make with respect to growth and the decisions we make with respect to developing strategy, right? To counter those forces. Lesson number 2 was really about breaking down the components of strategy, right? Strategies are complex systems. And similar to all complex systems, the key to understanding it is to break them down into their smallest parts. So as I stated, when we had unlocked this sort of growth tactic and we were really trying to scale that channel up, we really focused on just 4 components of strategy that needed to be clear, right, in order to create strategic clarity in our organization. Those things were objectives, constraints, actions, and priorities. These are the building blocks of strategy. They can be applied across different units. They can be applied across activities. They definitely apply to growth. You need the minimum components of strategy that you need, right? Objectives, you have to have good collaborative effort on your objectives, understand what it is you want to accomplish. Your constraints, what are your degrees of freedom? What are the things that you can and can't do? In a startup environment, budget could be a constraint. Speed could be a constraint. Resources could be a constraint. Identifying those things and then understanding the actions that you can take, right, that are going to move you closer to those objectives and overcome those constraints, right? That's very important. And then lastly, prioritizing those over a time period. So these are the components of strategy. These are really the components of lean strategy. And this led me to really think about the strategic process, right? The core needs of strategic process, especially, and this I think is especially true for startups, and especially true for growth marketers, need efficiency, right? We have to do our work very fast. in the startup environment where you have numerous stakeholders, everyone from board members to the CEO to investors, right? And you're in the process of trying to raise more funds, being able to bring your tactics to market and show clean product market fit and high growth is essential in the early parts of in the early days of the business. But the strategy also needs to be extensible. You need to be able to shift and pivot as your internal and external environment change. And it has to be adaptable, right? It means as things happen, right, as there may be impacts in the internal external environment that don't necessarily affect you or your growth team, but may affect other areas of the business, product, customer success, right? So that adaptability is really a core need of the strategic process. The goal is not to create the most encompassing, in-depth strategy possible. The goal is to create a strategy that delivers on its objectives with as little development as possible that is needed to reach strategic clarity. This is the lean strategy process. When we look at what this looks like, spelled out in the steps, our first step is research. It's understanding the internal and external environment. It's identifying the opportunities and risk, and identifying our objectives and constraints. In the creation step of this process, we're developing actions that support those objectives, satisfy constraints. We're prioritizing the actions that are most critical in reaching the objectives. Activation is about execution of strategic actions, development of measurement plans. And analysis is determining whether the strategy successfully met its objectives, and if not, why. At the conclusion of this, you simply go back and you do this again. So in terms of applying this particular strategy to growth, right, and to new tactics, right, you have to take the time to do the research up front, right? And I think as growth marketers, maybe the most important thing that we miss is understanding where we're going to unlock demand. If I think about what growth is all about, it's about identifying your target audience and segmenting them accordingly. Of that target audience, finding that segment which has the highest demand, right? The highest latent demand that's there. And then also understanding that segment is not being served by the current market, right? So current products don't completely meet their need. And then unlocking and understanding the channels in which you can find those people, right? So that is really the research phase of the strategic process. And this is really important for a growth marketer. And in today's really key shifting environment, we could be seeing situations change very drastically over the course of the next year, right? The focus on cost recovery and maximizing savings to sort of play for the stretch sounds extremely scary to any growth marketer, right? Especially when you are a pre-seed startup or a stage where you're expected to deliver this growth, and that you're going to be doing that already, where typically in the startup environment we're working in budget constrained environments, understanding that now that could be even more tight and even more difficult really puts an emphasis on us to develop a strategic process that's very quick, that allows us to test a large number of ideas in a very clear and concise way. And so this strategic process, the lean strategy process, is all about, really being able to bring strategy to market very quickly. Lean strategy is favorable to any organization or any activity that is just in a constantly changing internal or external. As tech startup leaders, that sort of defines our world. We're constantly in a shift. The key to effective collaboration during the strategic process is really key. It's like having that effective collaboration is key, because this creates strategic clarity with both the stakeholders and the resources. The idea is that by understanding your objectives, your constraints, your actions, and your priorities, by following a sort of clear strategic process to tell a story about the strategy that you're going to execute, it really does allow for strategic clarity between both stakeholders and resources. If I think back to the conditions that really gave me stress or anxiety in the early part of or the late part of 2020, early part of 2021, it was the lack of strategic clarity, right? We found growth and acquisition success, but I'm not sure we ever really tackled this problem of lack of strategic clarity. And as a result, we burned through resources. We went through 3 or 4 different marketing leaders in our first year, right? Like, this is a real key point to holding on to the people you have. I think that as growth marketers, sometimes we overlook how important both our direct reports and our colleagues and peers can be to moving fast and effectively. Losing people in today's market creates a particular strain, as we know that acquiring talent resources is more and more difficult. So this process really can be used to develop growth strategy. And I know Andre spoke to theoretical concerns and sort of being very, very specific, but I actually think that if you look at sort of the things that marketers tend to go back and wonder about what they could have done better when they started in a growth marketing position or at a startup, we almost always wish that we could have done a better job of aligning on strategy, right? When we fall short of our objectives, right? Like, aside from feeling like we missed tactics or missed opportunities, I think what we really go back and look at is like, man, I didn't spend enough time on the strategy, or I did just enough that was needed to sort of get us out the door. But, as time went on, we started to become overly dependent on tactic, and we never really grew from there. Growth channels can be discovered, but to scale them effectively requires strategy. So this model for lean strategy and growth is simply about developing it. This is not anything that I would say is, it's a bunch of new thinking or magic. It simply reflects the fact that as a marketer, I hate the fact that we spend a lot of our time being stressed out and being anxious about our numbers. And going into the next year, coming out of, while the money and the investments have been great, that's not to say that, like, as growth marketers, our jobs haven't been extremely hard in the last 2 years, right? All this money that is poured into startups through VC and investment, right, has made leaders more ambitious, right, and has put more stress on growth marketers to effectively grow and scale organizations and to do it very, very quickly. Right, we've had an incredibly tough 2 years, and so as we move into the next year, the idea that we're going to have to continue to do this with perhaps less resources, really, to me, I'm scared that that we're all going to lose our minds, right? That the anxiety that I experienced in the previous year would be something that other people would experience. So this topic today was all about sort of using myself as a parable for what it's like to be in the chair and be a growth marketer, to unlock that sort of growth in the beginning of the journey, to see that sort of fall apart, and to try and diagnose the more strategic ways, like the higher takeaways that we can use to do our job better. And I think there's going to be plenty of people to talk about tactics today, to talk about case studies. What I would challenge us all to do today, as we hear these points, which are extremely important, is to just think about the process that we would use to figure out how to drive those tactics within our own organization, right? The strategic processes that will create clarity within our own group and hopefully not lead us to stress. Lean strategy is key to navigating the current conditions. It allows for transition and changes in strategy based on the current condition. And most importantly, it reduces the time and waste. As marketers, our strategies tend to fall into different buckets, right? Strategy that sort of pleases the boss sometimes. And there's a strategy that gives us the most clarity and the actions that we need to take. And we're constantly compromising between those two groups. The lean strategy simply breaks it down to its basic components and gives us a blueprint for how we can take actions very quickly to address changing objectives and or changing environmental conditions. So I hope that this has been helpful to you. Again, my main purpose here is, like I said, I don't want to see more. I hate to see marketers suffer. And I think as growth professionals, we've all had those long, anxious nights, wondering whether or not we were going to be successful. So this was just a primer to understand that. Given that we have about 8 minutes left here, I wanted to open this up to questions. I also would love to, this is obviously a work in progress. I would love to hear points about this. If you've used a different strategic model, any clarifications or modifications that you see, obviously, and we'll go from there. So I turn it back over to you. I don't believe I can hear you, Javi.
Thank you for that. Sorry, I was on mute. I just want to say thank you so much for that talk. That was incredible insight. Really appreciate you sharing all that valuable information with us. Definitely took about a full page worth of notes, I would say. So really looking forward to connecting with you. While we wait for some questions to come in, how can people connect with you?
Yeah, sure. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. You can just look me up, Na'im McKee. I try to respond to everybody's messages, and I honestly do. From time to time, I'll send surveys out and just talk to people about sort of the things that they're experiencing. The last survey I did was really about strat. Before I sort of, prepared this presentation, I sent out a survey on strategy in terms of startups. And I sent that out to other leaders and to marketers. And so I'm always up for sharing materials that I have. I very much believe in the fact that, like, as growth marketers, we're a community. So you can find me on LinkedIn.
Amazing. Thank you. So while we wait for questions to come in, I have a question for you.
Sure.
As a marketing and growth leader yourself, what if you can kind of think back about like when you were first starting, what's a piece of advice that you would give your 20-year-old self about starting this new role, especially during like the pandemic?
Yeah, very good question. What advice would I give myself? The first thing I would say is, don't give up on while growth marketing and sort of classic marketing are really sort of two different things. The real key foundational components of marketing, the better you execute those, the better you're going to be in the long run in terms of your growth efforts. Understanding your take the time to really understand, right, your classic 4 Ps, right? What is your product, your place, your price? Like, understand your current environment and your external environment, and really, really pay attention to what your competitors and your customers are doing, both directly in your vertical and tangential to it. Because what I would say is, what was funny about unlocking that growth tactic for us is that we were hovering right around like where like that channel, and so we were trying a bunch of things and we were all stuck thinking, man, nothing is working. It really was just that simple, quick look and glance at what a competitor was doing, and that really unlocked, like, oh, we're very close, here's what got us over the line. And so I would say, just my advice would be, like, don't short the research, because that's really, really, really important to identifying those high growth tactics. And to the guy that I am a Cincinnati Reds fan. I'm not a Cubs fan, but I didn't wear my hat. I typically do wear my hat today. I did not wear it because I sat on it yesterday, and I have to get a new one. So, sorry to I think it's Comedy Peripheral, quite a name, but sorry to you, sir. I didn't mean to disappoint you.
Bummer. I was going to ask if you were a Cubs or a White Sox fan, but you seem to answer that question. But yeah, no. So in regards to your response, I haven't seen and please feel free, audience, to drop your questions in for Na'im. Something that I get the opportunity to host events like this across the country, and I get to speak with a lot of growth leaders. And one thing that, really has struck a chord with me is like this concept of like continuing to experiment, and what works, kind of double down on it, and what doesn't work, kind of take it out back and kill it, or at least put it, back in the reserves, right? Because it doesn't mean that if an idea is not working today, it's not because it doesn't work. It's because maybe today is not the right day, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the foundation of that, point of experimentation is really like just basically follows a scientific model for marketing, right? So, it's really about identifying the variables that impact success, right? So on any growth tactic, the primary objective of your research, right, is to identify the variables of success. What is the right message? What is the time and the place? Who is the right audience? What are the specific channels, right? Like those are all your variables. And as you start, you just sort of dial them in, right? So the right tactic, right, is just one of those variables, right? Like all these other things have to be tested. And to do that, you need a real clear process. I don't like to do multivariate testing, when it comes to growth tactics. I like to really focus on testing one or two things a week, right? And then having a plan. And so the lean strategy process can be applied to that same key point of experimentation, but it just puts it in a very rational context. And it also allows you to sort of execute your growth, like sort of your growth strategy and your larger marketing strategy have the same components to it, right? So it's a lot easier to understand. Sometimes like talking a leader through, the outputs of growth experimentation and like why these two variables have higher correlation coefficients and like why it produces this outcome can be very difficult. But understanding the objectives and the actions can be very easy. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you that making sure that you when a tactic is put in the market and you're experimenting with it, like understand that like all those variables are going to impact the degree to which it's successful, and things may not be successful at a certain time, but that lack of outcome is just more of a prompt to continue to test and experiment.
Amazing. Well, I really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you so much, Na'im. It was an absolute pleasure having you on today. Like I said, I look forward to connecting with you, and thank you to the audience that joined us. Do you have any last parting words before we move on to our next presentation?
My only last parting words are to all my growth marketers and potential growth leaders out there. If it doesn't feel right, it doesn't mean it's your fault. Like, don't spend your time beating yourself up, right? Focus on what's important and really think about the logical steps of your actions and think about where you're going as an organization. So, because all those things really matter. So that's my only parting advice to everyone.
Well, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that. It was a pleasure speaking with you again. I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.